Hey guys, new review today, and this was an interesting one actually. This is Warpgate from Wolf Designer. This is not a new game, or at least not a brand new game. I think this came out in 2018, and it took me a while before I actually got round to trying it. You can get it on retail release, but I just sort of never really came across it. I knew one person in my club who had it. He'd constantly been saying, "Oh, do you want to play this?" And I'd always brushed it aside to play something else because I had other stuff to review. But eventually I got a copy at Essen and decided, you know what, I gotta sit down and play this and give it a decent review if I can. Well, what Warpgate is trying to do is it's essentially trying to be a Space 4X game, which can be done in a fraction of the time of a typical space game like Empires of the Void 2, Twilight Imperium 4, Exodus Proxima Centauri, Xayah, all those epic space games that take hours and hours and hours. This one tries to do it in something like 90 minutes, it claims. It claims it can basically do it in 20 minutes per player time ratio. So maximum 2 hours if you're playing with the full count of 6 players. It goes all the way up to 6. And like any other Space 4X game, you are building your ships, sending them out to different planets in order to research new technologies that give you special abilities. You take control of a faction with its own special power, and you are collecting trade goods that give you an ability and fulfilling objectives that give you points. It feels very much like Twilight Imperium in that regard. The twist with this is you have these boards with 1x, 2x, 3x, and 4x on it, and they vary between some of the factions. You know, they are unique, and you've got quite a lot in here, as you can see. But the idea is that you have cards which you play down onto this board, and they all have an effect like attacking, moving, and researching, and so on. But they usually have a modifier X, and with the X value, you essentially treat the space you put the card on as the value on the action. So if you put it on the first thing, typically it will be 1x. So it might say you get to move a ship 1 range. But if you were to leave it until the last action you do in the round, then it's 4x. So you end up being able to move something at range 4, or deploy 4 ships instead of 1, or go attack with 2 groups instead of 1. You know, it's done like that. So essentially you have a hand of cards, and you're deciding which order you want to play the cards in that round, each of which has 2 actions on it to give you anywhere between 8 actions or draw actions in order to actually, do in your turn. And it's about planning what you're going to do and when. But you don't plan all 4 out. This is not a programming game. You essentially do 1 action, and then the next player, then the next player, and the next player gets back round to you, and then you do the second one, and then it goes on. The idea being that it's meant to be super fast turns. We'll get onto that a bit later. So, does it meet the criteria of a decent space game? And does it fulfill the objectives it sets out to do? Let's look at it in more detail. So firstly, let's get on to the big one, and that is the duration of the game. This one claims 20 minutes per player, and it really goes to town about this on the back of the box. I mean, I gotta be careful because it's got lots of pieces in it, but on the back it's got, 2-player game of Warpgate can be completed in 40 minutes. Next thing you know, it's your turn again. You'll remember all the rules by the end of round 2. No sitting in your own corner, blah, blah, blah. It makes a lot of bold claims. Does it succeed? Not exactly, although it's still good when compared to the other space games. 20 minutes per player is kind of wishful thinking, really. I mean, you've got 4 different actions you've got to do in a turn. There's 3 different ways the game can end, but, they tick down at different rates. So if they tick down at an even rate, it's going to take a bit longer. You're going to have AP generated from players because of, oh, God, what am I going to do with the card? Because you can only plan so much before it's your turn because of the tactical element. 20 minutes per player is kind of stretching it, and that's certainly not including setup and takedown time, which can take a little bit of a while as well. So you've got to add that onto the 20 minutes thing. There is nobody out there who is playing a 2-player game of this with setup and takedown, including maybe even a rules teach, in 40 minutes. That just does not happen. The first time I played this with 3 new players, and I was fairly new to the game myself, but I'd read the rules, it took us about, say, 4 players took us about 90 minutes, plus the rules teach. And that's still pretty good for a 4-player space game to do it in 90 minutes rather than 6 hours. But it's not entirely the same as the bold claim they're making on the back of the box. Certainly I would say 30 minutes per player is a more realistic estimate of how long this game will take. It will probably set you back more than 2 hours if you're playing it with 5 and 6 players, particularly if you've got new players involved. Now, I did play it with players who had seen the game before, and it did go quicker. So I think you need some experience with the game in order to bring it down to that bold claim of the duration, but it's going to take a while for people to get to that level, and even then, you're not going to play this with the same group all the time in the real world. You're probably going to have new players come and go, and so then you got to teach them again, and then they're like, okay, so how does this action work? You know, it's going to slow the game down. That being said, I didn't feel like there was a huge amount of downtime between turns, other than with AP-prone people who can slow down anything, and I felt that the turns actually could come around pretty quickly if you had people who knew what they were doing, or just took their turn and stopped delaying the game. So the game does actually succeed at being shorter and quicker than all the other space games out there, but it's not exactly lightning fast, if that makes any sense. So the ease of play, yeah, well, it's actually not that difficult a game to learn. I mean, this is the rulebook, which is pretty big, but if I show that the back page is basically the solo mode, more on that later, you've got 2 pages to set it up with decent pictorial representation of how to set up this hexagonal board, and then you have got a total of 8 pages to learn, but there's a lot of pictorial representation in here. This is actually a pretty solid rulebook. I'm not sure if I think Paul Grogan said to me at one point that he'd helped a little bit with this. You know, he had some input on the way this was written. If that's true, then it shows. But this actually is not a very difficult rulebook to read. I mean, even if you're just playing this from the get-go, from scratch, it wouldn't take you too long to get used to this. And certainly, all I had to do was read through it once, and I felt like I was confident enough to teach most of the game. Granted, I got 1 or 2 rules wrong on my first play, but, you know, they were quickly sorted, and they were little fiddly bits here and there. It's not a perfect rulebook, because there are 1 or 2 elements I found where it doesn't explain something unless you look in the example, and then the example explains this key point you need to know. It's like, oh, right, why didn't it say that in the paragraph before? You know, there's 1 or 2 occasions like that, but if you just take your time and read through it properly, you will actually find that it's not that difficult to learn, certainly not compared to the other space games that are out there. However, for new players, they are going to freeze up with a bit of analysis paralysis at times. You've got 4 different actions to plan, but you've got 8 to choose from, and that's assuming you don't draw more cards by various effects in a round. It's not an easy game for brand new players to gaming to get into, and anyone who's not familiar with the whole action card planning system. So moving on to tactics and strategy, this is where Warpgate really actually starts to come into its own. The card management system is really cool. I love the way that, you know, the later you leave an action, the more powerful it is. But sometimes you want to do that action first, but then you have to realize it won't be as powerful. You won't be able to do as much with it. But I really need to get that ship onto that planet. And if I wait, I can't do my awesome action later. So I'm going to have to do this first. But then I'm using up this card where I might want the research action later, but I need the bottom part of this card first. And I've only got a hand size of 4, I can't draw any more cards. I could take an action to draw cards, but then hang on a minute, that means I'm doing less in the round, but it may be useful still. It's not necessarily a bad thing to draw more cards. There's a lot of cool turn angst with this game, just from like deciding which cards you're going to use. And I love multi-use cards, as you've seen me in other videos. You know, the idea that a card has multiple uses. I can put it face down to draw cards, which is not as common, but still it's an action, or I can use the top or the bottom action. And it's like deciding which one of those top or bottom actions I want to do. It really does come into its own. And it's very much it's got a bit of strategy and tactics, because you need to kind of think, right, well, I've collected some objectives and they want me to score for these. I can't do them all. It's physically impossible to do too many of them. But you're thinking, right, well, I need to focus on that type of planet, probably get that color technology, and at least have a bunch of ships on other people's colonies, for example. You know, fine, I'm going to go for that. That's my strategy. But you gotta be tactical, because people are taking over colonies left, right, and center, establishing their own trade routes, planets free up, suddenly a technology comes off the deck and it's blue, and it's like, oh, I need to go to a blue planet in order to have a look at that. That'd be pretty sweet. So you have to react to what's happening in the game, and so this impacts a little bit on your ability to plan for the next turn, but it's a cool, dynamic flow of gameplay where you have to pay attention to what's going on. You have to pay attention to the opponents. There is interaction, because they can attack you and, you know, blow up your ships and potentially blow up theirs in a suicidal charge. You've got a very cinematic combat system with drawing cards from a separate tactics deck, the tactics deck which you can actually upgrade during the game as a different action, so you can have unique cards that no one else has. You even have a starting card that no one else has. Again, a bit of replay value there. And with these tactic cards, you draw them and you have to decide which one you're going to use, and they have modifiers and decent effects. The bigger the modifier, the possibility that you're going to lose stuff like in kamikaze charges, but the lower the effect, the more that you can do some cool effect on yourself, or possibly even hinder the opponent slightly. You know, there's a lot of cool decisions that you have to make, and for a game that's supposedly a fraction of most space games, it does a pretty good job of giving you plenty to think about, despite being shorter and a lot more simpler, and certainly less like up a behemoth as something like Twilight Imperium 4. Now we get onto the aesthetics, and the aesthetics are actually pretty decent as well. I mean, you've got some pretty solid artwork on these cards, and there's quite a fair amount of them. I mean, you'll bag them up, you'll get them in their sleeves and etc. You've got a bunch of tokens for an expansion, but you do get some pretty nice sculpts for the various ships and that. I mean, you've got little basic tokens where, you know, these essentially just like are markers, and they're standard tokens, nothing major. But you do get a few, you know, miniatures in there. So you've got some, you know, fairly basic ships. They're nothing to sing home about, and everybody's got the same sculpt, which is a slight worry. But you know, they give you little pieces. It's not just a token. Each player has a model for this research drone that goes out and gets technology. So there's a decent amount in the box, even though it's not going to win any awards for like component quality. But you do get some pretty solid pieces for the board itself. I mean, these are the starting tiles. So, you know, they've got their big flashy color and starting planet. But then when you get into the hexes themselves, they're pretty decent as well. I mean, there's lots of different types that you can come across, and they're pretty large. They're, you know, you can easily see what's on there. The board can get busy with a lot of pieces on it, but it never feels like it's like, oh, I can't tell what's going on, you know. And the artwork on this is very good. I mean, each of these planets just pops off the board. They've all got a unique style to them, so even if you're colorblind, it's not the best game to play if you're colorblind, I will say, but there are some graphic design things that they've put in to try and help with that. Some of the planets, you know, there's a volcano planet with lava that's breaking up, you've got the white one with rings, but yeah, if you're colorblind, you're probably going to struggle with this, but otherwise, you'll get a lot of nice, you know, picturesque artwork on these tiles with the sectors clearly marked off in, you know, the big, like that sort of weird blue segment that says this is in that sector. It's pretty easy to see. So then moving on to the immersion of theme, this one takes a little bit of a hit, but not much. Obviously, with the giant 4X space games, you know, theme is a big deal. You know, you've got a lot of theme in something like Twilight Imperium 4. There is a ton of theme in Empires of the Void 2, hence I really love it. But this one has to abstract things a little bit in order to make it shorter and less like those games. But there is still some thematic elements in there. I mean, you are still establishing a trade route, and it has to go from separate planets, and you can't, you know, if somebody's in your way, it's like a blockade. The actions themselves, you know, you are going off and attacking other people. You are setting up colonies on planets that other people can come and, you know, stay with you or, you know, take them off you. You have got the tactics combat, which is slightly cinematic in the way it plays out. Like, if you play a high modifier, it's because your ship crashed into the enemy, so you have to lose it at the end. There are thematic touches here and there. The races, I kind of just, whatever, their races, their player powers. I mean, some of them kind of fit what their abilities are. Like, there's one that gets a more streamlined, uniform, like modifier system for their cardboard, like 2x, 3x, 3x, that kind of thing. And they're a droid army. So it kind of makes sense that they would have an ability like that. There's one that look like traveling merchants, so they're pretty good with trade goods. There are some, like I say, some thematic touches that work. But yeah, you're not quite getting the same immersion as something like Empires, and possibly not even TI4, though I would argue that TI4 is abstracted to some extent. You know, but that's the price you pay when you know, take stuff and make it into a smaller game. But I don't think Warpgate is like an abstract game. It is certainly not a dry game. I feel like I am my space faction going off and doing this stuff in space. Yes, I'm not doing diplomacy with other races.
Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey.
Yes, I'm not conquering planets for resources per se. I'm just going there, playing these cards and getting more objective cards, but I'm getting technologies as well. So it's there, but it's a bit more piecemeal, and you kind of have to like tie the loose ends together and join the dots, as opposed to something like Empires that would just like feed it to you in dripping glass bowlfuls of theme. And then finally, longevity. Longevity in this game should be pretty decent. I mean, you have got, you know, the variable setup for the board, so the map is going to be different. You've got up to 6 players who can play this, and it works fine at all player counts. I found that 2-player worked just fine, so did 4. 5 and 6 can take a bit long for my liking, so I'm less keen on that, but it does create a pretty congested board with lots going on, and if you've got people who are familiar with the game, a 6-player game will actually feel pretty good, and even at its most epic of lengths, it won't be as long as TI4 or Xayah or any of those ones, so it's again still going to be shorter. The cards themselves, you're using the same deck as everyone else. I wish there was a little bit more variety, but then I suppose that would have been quite a balancing feat to try and get right. But these tactic cards that you use are pretty cool in the way that there's a huge amount of them that are totally unique, and one of them is unique to a particular faction, and you can decide for the whole game, you know what, I'm not going to upgrade my deck. I'm just going to have basic tactics. I'm just going to have to deal with the fact that I'm pretty easy to kill in combat. But maybe I'm like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to constantly promote, and I'm just going to build this deck full of cool cards, and now I'm going to go off on a killing spree. You know, they can take a different path to victory, especially when the technologies and the objectives will come out at different times. You'll have access to them at different times, and they will dictate a bit of how you're going to do your game, especially the technologies. But the best thing that's going to help are two things. Firstly, the faction boards. You've got quite a few of them in here. I forget the exact number, but I think the Kickstarter Deluxe version had 16 different factions you could use. This one I think has 12. But you know, and each one has got an A and a B side. So you've got two different abilities that they can have, two different variations. You know, not crazy variations, but, you know, a different ability is a different ability. You'd also have a solo mode in here, which is actually pretty decent as well. An AI deck that you flip a card over, much like the Autumners and things like Stonemaier games, will dictate what the enemy will do, and they'll go around and make colonies and blow up your ships and take a technology card off you and that. So it simulates a human player, but actually is a relatively good way to A, learn the game, and B, just actually enjoy a space game solo. There aren't many of them out there when you think about it. Can you play Xayah solo? I'm not entirely sure, but, you know, someone correct me on this. I can't play Empires of the Void solo, I can't play TI4 solo, I can't play Exodus Proxima Centauri solo, I don't think. You know, most of these space games involve other players. So the fact you've got a solo mode here is already putting Warpgate in this niche gap that, you know, hasn't been filled by any other space game that I'm aware of. And yeah, before you start getting on my case saying, oh, but what about Space Core 2035 or whatever that rubbish pile of garbage was. Seriously, if you're going to put that as a solo spacefaring game, that abstracted, mathematical, point blowing up out of proportion nightmare luck fest as that 4-hour luck fest as a suitable solo space game,
how about no?
So my final word is that Warpgate is an underrated space game that deserves more attention. It offers similar concepts to other spacefaring games, like technologies, objectives, space battles, and colonizing planets, but it does so in a fraction of the time, and yet includes a decent amount of replay value and a solo mode, and will likely hit the table a lot more often. This does what I need it to do. Gives me a simple space game in a relatively short time. Granted, it's not going to supplant something like Empires of the Void 2 for me, but it still is going to stay in my collection, and I think I'll bring it out every now and again. So this one I'm giving a 8 out of 10 and a decent seal of endorsement. I think this is underrated on Board Game Geek at the moment. It's somewhere in the 4,000s. I don't think it's got a huge amount of distribution out there, but you should be able to get a copy. And honestly, I think if space is your kind of theme and you want something that can be done in a shorter time or even solo, give this one a look. You might be genuinely surprised. So that's it for me. I'll see you on the next Broken Meeple video. If you like what you see, please subscribe, ding the dons, subscribe to the Patreon and all that gubbins. And for now, regardless of whether you enjoy a space game that's 30 minutes, 2 hours, 6 hours, or takes 3 days, what does it matter? It's still only a game. So enjoy it regardless. Take care, and I'll see you on the next review.